Maybe we can depart just from this picture for the moment, but you already referenced the proverbial painting that has yellowed on the wall that you might pick off but what are the typical culprits that over hundreds of years result in the need for restoration? What sorts of things happen around the painting, and then
what effects I'm talking about, within a narrow band of what we, loosely call old master paintings. So paintings in the tradition from the Renaissance through, and even still today, but certainly early 20th century, where an easel painting. So I mean by that, not fresco, not works on paper. So that's how our profession sort of breaks down. And so most of those pictures, with some exceptions, but most of them are conceived as being painted in either oil or egg based media on canvas or wood, and they are what they are. And then at some stage, they're given a varnish coating, which helps saturate the colors and provides a layer of protection. And those varnishes over the centuries have evolved a lot in what they're made out of, but they're the thing that typically degrades and oxidizes. And the main culprit there is the ultraviolet part of the light that you see. And they gather dirt and atmospheric pollution, etc. So those varnishes break down and become yellow, orange. They become warmer, darker. They also develop a fine kind of craquelure, so they're like the equivalent of looking through a broken windscreen or a net curtain. They kind of become a bit hazy. So colors all shift to the yellow. Light tones become darker. Dark tones become lighter because they've got this kind of hazy film over them. And that tends to, obscure artistic intent in terms of what the painters were trying to do. That's one of the things that we're dealing with is renewing those varnishes, removing them and renewing them. The other thing is that pictures have a life, and they go through changes and damages and changes of taste. And historically, when pictures were damaged, their pictures were restored as long as they were being made. Up until fairly recently, the last century or so, most people who repaired paintings were painters. And generally, if there were losses to be done, there's different approaches about what they would do. They would do these things called retouchings, which is what we do. But I think there wasn't a kind of professional understanding of the job. They were very free to, in general, we restrict our retouching to compensating for damages and being very light touch. But I think there was no, and many times over the last few centuries, there was no problem with an artist improving pictures and deciding that this would be better, or repainting areas, or editing in a way that's much more interventive. And furthermore, they did that generally with the paint that was very similar to the paint used by the artist. Now, oil paint typically gets quite a bit darker in the first century that it lives, and then that kind of curve flattens out a bit. So let's just say in 1850, you're an artist and you've been asked to restore a Renaissance painting, and you reinterpret a drapery or decide that this guy would look better with red hair than brown hair or whatever. You do your work, or maybe you're very careful and only do careful, beautifully matched retouchings and the losses. But your lovely fresh oil paint that matches when you've applied it will darken while the original paint has stopped darkening. And your oil paint chemically will get harder and harder and harder and more difficult to remove. So we spend a lot of our time effectively unzipping old restorations and dealing with the consequences of that. And it's not like I'm going to say everything we do now is amazing and perfect, but I think there are some analogies about the progress of technology. If you think about, medicine or something like that, we are able to do things now that are more stable and more reversible. And we certainly we're much more circumspect about the interpretive aspect.
Well, returning to the London version of the rocks as opposed to the Louvre version, you mentioned that the varnishes shift and colors shift and obviously that's going to be particularly important for a painting like this when the colors aren't arbitrary but meant to reflect an improved understanding of vision. But my understanding is that the problem, or the main reason that this painting needed a touch up, was from a varnish that was put on there in 1928.
48, yeah. Yeah.
Oh, 48. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
I hit the wrong key when I wrote that down. So maybe I should ask one, I mean, just what chemically constitutes a varnish before we talk about, I mean, how you get it off and what sort of goes into the calculus of deciding what to put on to
Well, the varnish is a
make.
transparent film. It's a resin. And until very recently, it's a natural resin from various things. Sometimes older varnishes are combinations of resinous substances from plants, or like damar, or and they also mixed oil with them to make a very lustrous, transparent coating. But those tend to get very hard and discolor. I mean, we still use natural resin varnishes sometimes now, and now we have some synthetic ones as well. But they were always, I mean, certainly from the Baroque period, and actually we've got some examples of Renaissance varnishes, very old varnishes that are still intact, but they've always been seen as that layer that comes off when they, in most cases, not every case. I can talk about details later, I mean, exceptions. Some artists, you'd have to say the varnish is integral to what the painting is, and you can't really disturb it, but for others, not so much. So yeah, that varnish is meant to be a translucent, glossy, well, transparent, fairly glossy, saturating layer that adds luster to the colors, that adds some depth to the darker tones, and provides physical protection.
Mm. And you just mentioned that there are synthetics and novel varnishes, but I'm wondering if, when you're touching up a painting, do you feel committed for purposes of authenticity to using the same oil or egg-based
Absolutely
paint?
not. No, that's the whole point. That was what people did before, and as I explained, if I were to use oil paint today, my retouchings would be darker than the thing they were matched.
Okay, that's what I was thinking.
So no, we need to understand the painting technique and replicate it very faithfully, but in as much as we can do it in stable, reversible equivalence. And the basic idea of any old master painting, if you think about how it's put together, it's about what's on top and what's below, and what's transparent and what's opaque, and how those things are manipulated. And so we definitely mimic layer structures. I mean, the easiest thing to say is that everybody knows if you mix, blue and yellow, you get green. Yeah, easy. But you can also get green by putting transparent yellow over an opaque blue. It looks different, but it's green, and you have to know which way that green was made if you're retouching a picture. And you can't mix two colors if they're on the picture you're matching are done by superimposing colors. And if that whole thing is influenced by an underlayer that's quite red, for example, then we'll copy all that. And so we may not use exactly the same pigments, but we certainly manipulate the transparencies and opacities and layer structures very, very faithfully. So from that point of view, yeah, we are very authentic, but we will do it with synthetic or reversible materials. We'll do it on top of the varnish that we apply. So I could spend years retouching a picture, and anyone could wash it off in 15 minutes with a very mild, completely risk-free solvent, because that's how it's supposed to be. It's meant to be something that's not set in stone.
This idea of what's on top and what's below, I think we'll talk more about the layer structure when we get to Caravaggio, but most people, or maybe just me, tend to think of paintings as flat, two-dimensional objects. Of course, there are these absolutely beautiful, almost geological images in your articles of these, I don't know what you'd want to call them.
cross sections,
cross
of all the layers,
sections of the paintings, but where the paint forms these like sedimentary layers, like something you might see at the Grand Canyon or
exactly.
in a
And that's just it, because I think again it goes back to this idea that we think about 20th century artists kind of emoting on the canvas and mixing all the colors and going in one go, and not thinking about building up things, and that's just not how it was. That's just the craft of it was very different.
Mm-hmm. Where I was going to go with this, though, is how do you use non-invasive methods like infrared imaging or X-rays to get a sense of the condition of a painting before you start touching it up and working with it?
Well, they often will show you things that you can't see so easily with the naked eye. I mean, X-radiography will tell you about. I mean, it's more than just telling you where the holes are, although they're very good at doing that, because they, where the damages are, where the losses are. An X-ray will show you those things, or an infrared might show you, because the way it reflects in the infrared, you can see some paint that might look very similar is actually applied later in a different way, and it'll show blotchy. They do all those things, which is great, to really assess on a nuts and bolts way the condition. But they also are very useful tools to help to understand how something was made. An X-ray looks at the total atomic weight, the density of all the paint throughout all the layers. It doesn't distinguish between layers. It adds them all up and adds. So, and luckily enough, some of the more important lighter colors are atomically really heavy. So like lead white paint, which is used ubiquitously, is very heavy. And so in an X-ray, it reads as white. So for example, simple thing. You've got a head and shoulders portrait of somebody with a blue sky in the background. The blue sky, because it's mostly white, will show very, very white on the X-ray. Does that blue sky, that big white layer, does that go behind the head, or does it go around the head? And if it goes around the head, then that tells you, the head was drawn in, perhaps worked up to a certain level. The sky was painted around it. Then maybe some of the hair was pulled back over the sky. It's that sort of thing. Where you see a great white band across the top half of the picture, and you can barely see the face, and that the sky was blocked in its entirety, head added later. I mean, that's a pretty mundane question to ask, but it's that sort of thing you can look at, and it can start to tell you how much of a composition, if you've got very complicated overlaps, and you don't see that so much in the X-ray, that tells you that, there's a lot of planning, a lot of drawing, maybe on another piece of paper, maybe this, the whole thing was transferred in some way, wasn't improvised, those kinds of things. You can see changes. You can see if you've got two versions of the same picture, and one of them, that arm that looks exactly the same in X-ray shows that it was in a different place first, then that tells you something about their relationship between the two. So those are the kinds of things we use those images for, and there are all kinds of classes of images. We can effectively do X-rays for individual pigments now, and then it gets very complex and difficult to describe. But we use those images both. Sometimes we look at them to address specific conservation questions, but often it's just to help us understand how a picture was painted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in this painting in particular, did the infrared imaging, that X-rays, did this teach you anything about how the painting was done that you just hadn't anticipated?
The Virgin of the Rocks, you mean now?
Yes.
Oh, yeah. Well, it was one of the more impressive kind of eureka moments in my career, in that we found evidence of a completely different composition underneath ours, which now looks ostensibly very, very similar to the one in Paris. But there is a wholly different composition beneath, and that composition relates to lots of drawings, even tiny drawings that were made at a certain point. And the composition was taken quite far and modified at different times and abandoned. But this work underneath that panel places it at a certain place in time, makes it clear that it was done in Milan and it was, done in this particular decade, et cetera, et cetera. So there's lots of, and even in the 10 or 15 years since that discovery was made and the conclusions I drew, as the technology has moved along, we were able to see even more of 2 or 3 different kinds of compositions below what you see now, which have slightly changed our understanding of the relationship between the two paintings. So yeah, lots of things like that, which were really kind of pivotal, that it was much more complex how the two pictures evolved side by side than we had thought.
And this goes also back to Leonardo's restlessness that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, I mean, some painters, if there are 2 versions of the same one, there's one that might be a bit more perfunctory than the other, but they look pretty much the same. But with him, there's like 3 compositions underneath ours, so it's very complex, and we're still kind of unpicking all the implications of that.
One dimension of this painting in particular that I was curious about, I don't think it was mentioned in the articles I read, is the mountains. And when I look at these mountains or these rocks behind the Virgin, they immediately remind me of something that you might see in a Bosch painting or even like a much more modern. And they seem like nothing that Leonardo would ever see in Italy. That's just not what the mountains look like.
Well, there you can go down all sorts of rabbit holes about that. But there are people who have identified areas in northern Tuscany that look a bit like that. But yeah, it's art. It's fantastical. But he's certainly, whether or not there are portraits of individual landscapes, which is seriously unlikely, they nonetheless reflect interest in geological formations and how these things were formed.
You did say, though, that this is something of a reverie. And in dreams, if this is something of a dream-like state, things tend to get exaggerated, and these are some very extreme mountains.
He's quite interested in those things throughout most of his career. If you look at the Virginal Child with St. Anne and the Louvre, or the other Virgin of the Rocks, the Yard Winders, it's definitely a thing that interested him.
Well, there are 2 last things about this painting that I wanted to touch on before we moved on. And one of them is I'd never thought much about frames in museums before thinking about this painting. As I walk, I mean, the museum that I've spent the most time in by far is the Art Institute. And I just walk through the Art Institute of Chicago. And I walk through it and I just think, okay, they picked an old kind of goldish frame for every painting. That's just how they decided to do this. But how do you typically think about reframing a masterpiece like this? And what was the process?
That's a whole specialist thing, because I mean, for the Virgin of the Rocks, the frame was made before the painting. The painting was made to go in the frame. And the frame was not a frame, it was an altarpiece by this family called the Mainos. And there are some examples of their work still in northern Italy. They did these huge, complicated machines with, well, I call them machines, but many levels combining sculpture in the round, sculpture relief, panel paintings. They're unbelievably elaborate and fabulous things. And so this panel was the center of something that had at least 3 paintings in it. That relationship is gone now because we don't have all the other things. It's not in a church. It's not part of the enormous elaborate altarpiece about which the details of which are not completely understood or not agreed upon. And so, as is often the case in museums, when you're talking about framing an old master painting, the context is so different. So a religious altar might have had what we call a tabernacle frame, which is fairly architectural, designed to sit on an altarpiece. If you want to be accurate and have a tabernacle frame, but then hang it on a wall next to another picture, it is missing its kind of bottom. We are compromises all the time. So frames now, I think when you're talking about framing an old master painting, we know a lot about there are enough surviving historic frames and unchanged frames, but it's a tension between trying to frame a picture in something that would have been plausibly around it when it was made. But sometimes frames in museums are very important records of who's owned it subsequently. So, if Joshua Reynolds owned a Renaissance painting and put a frame around it, the same frame he put around all his paintings, then that Reynolds frame tells you something really interesting about what the 18th century believed about that picture. So maybe you want to keep that frame. Um, so there's a tension, I think, between all those things because the context is invariably very different when a picture's on a gallery wall. I mean, some great Baroque paintings were made for picture galleries, and so the context isn't that different. But many religious works were not designed to be lined up on a wall with 10 other ones. So lighting's different, viewing's different. So I think most old master galleries have that kind of interesting mix between frames that speak to the collecting history and then frames that are themselves historic. And if we reframe in a historic kind of frame, do we make a reproduction of a 16th century frame? Do we look for a 16th century frame? Yes to all those.
One of the neat and maybe selfish things about doing this show is that I learned things that I never would have encountered otherwise. And now, I mean, every time I go to a museum going forward, something new is going to pop out at me every time I look at a painting that wouldn't have questions about framing. And that's not really something that's often mentioned on like the little placard.
Well, that's the thing. If you think one thing from this podcast, is that this idea that a picture on the wall of the Art Institute or the Met or the Louvre, didn't get there handed down like a tablet to Moses. It got there because it's been bought and sold and changed hands, and people may have changed its shape and size and had different ideas about its quality and its framing, how frequently it was cleaned. It may have been hung opposite a window. It may not have been. They all have a history that affects a countless chain of people deciding things about them, about what to do with it and how to present it, from the minute it was painted till the way it's shown now. And all those things influence what you see. They're decisions taken with varying degrees of sensitivity over the centuries that affect the way pictures look, how often they've been cleaned, what kind of ideas about retouching, what kind of varnish, how they're lit, how they're framed. Yeah, that's all going on around them.
Would you say that one of your goals in restoring a painting, or is the goal in restoring the painting, just so you mentioned that I think it was the oil ages and it becomes darker, the oil-based paints, is your goal in restoring a painting to make it appear essentially as if, whatever this might mean, it's aged naturally over the past X years since it was painted, or do you want it to look as it was painted the day it was completed?
Certainly, that would be naive to think you could do that. I mean, there might be certain pictures that are miraculously well preserved, and if you take off the varnish, then they look more or less as they were painted. But you have to work with what you have, and almost always with old master paintings, individual pigments, regardless. Let's leave aside whether someone in 1810 decided it'd be a good idea to cut off a third of it, or do all that sort of thing. Let's just leave all that aside, or that it was particularly badly cleaned and damaged or whatever. But nearly always the individual colors age differently within a picture, and so the greens may become brown, some colors may become transparent, some may darken, some may fade, and then the further distortion of the yellow film across the whole thing takes it even further away. But let's say you remove this varnish beautifully, and then the picture is not going to show the same color relationships that it had. And that is a subject for discussion, because many people feel like, oh, well, at least that yellow film gave a kind of unity that now isn't there, because you might have a very bright red that was balanced beautifully against a blue, which now looks black. So there are different schools of thought about that. So anyway, I think the intent, as I see it, in cleaning and restoring old master pictures, is to allow what's there to speak as close as best it can, kind of unlock what's there and liberate it. You can say liberate it from obscuring films on the surface. I would say if you've got a lot of damages with poor retouchings or losses, that careful, attentive, in many cases, not always, but that doing the restoration also allows the surviving paint to speak properly.
Mhm. This wasn't a painting that I planned on discussing because there's only so many, but Rubens' Het Steen, which I think you might have finished restoring a couple of years ago, if I'm correctly. Yeah, in cleaning the sky, you really got the colors to speak in a way much more close to what was intended, one might
Yeah,
suspect.
that's quite there. If you have an effect which is designed to show, yellow highlights on the edges of clouds moving to a salmony pink sort of lit from below, and the sun actually in the picture painted yellow, and then the blue sky. And if you've got a yellow varnish over the whole thing, then the yellow stays yellow, but the blue goes very green. And so that fundamental relationship is just obscured by the yellow varnish. That wasn't a question really about intensive retouching or damage, just getting that yellow filter off unlocks something. But that's a picture where it has a very kind of warm russet brown orangey foreground, and then this really intense blue kind of cool sky with some yellow highlights, of course. And at different times in its history, that contrast, as created by Rubens, was thought to be a bit jarring, and different parts of that picture were toned by restorers to make the whole thing look a bit golden, the golden glow. So that, to me, is an example where I'd say getting off the varnishes on a picture by Rubens, who was such a fabulous technician, he suffers less than many, many artists from kind of changes that put the picture out of key to itself. So taking the varnish off just really allows that painting to sing and to sing for itself. But it is interesting that very intelligent and sensitive lovers of Rubens at different centuries thought, yeah, but it really needs a bit of tone to make it harmonious. So it's useful to remember those things and to know about the history of how people look at pictures. It's humbling because, what I'm quite confident about is core assumptions of the viewing experience, just may not hold true in a century.